Hi, Louise. It's good to see you. It's been a
Banana.
while.
Lovely to see you. Thanks for suggesting this and setting it up.
Yeah, I'm like so glad to talk to you about this book because as Anthony mentioned, I just wrote a piece on objectivity for the magazine. And honestly, like I thought I had read a lot of your work and was familiar with a lot of your work. But the book that we're going to be talking about today, Only Natural, beautiful cover, by the way. I'm going to ask about that in a moment. It's like a literal treasure chest of goodies. It's just been, and I only read like, I only like specifically read closely 4 of the essays. And it was just like, wow, there's so much stuff in here. So I just want to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about how this book came to be. The subtitle is Gender Knowledge and Humankind, and so I'm wondering, like, what does the title tell us about the context and content of the book, and how did the essays come to be? What made it in, and why?
So it's a career spanning collection. Um, uh, as I explained at length in my introduction, and I won't go on at that length here, but I've been an activist pretty much all my adult life. I discovered philosophy my freshman year in college when I was 19 years old. I thought, okay, I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in philosophy. I should do philosophy of politics. And I found that I couldn't stand the literature. I really wanted to be thinking, well, at the time, I wanted to be thinking about possible worlds. As I got older, I wanted to be thinking about language and mind. And so I just thought, well, I'll just, be a citizen and do my activism, and then I'll be an academic and do my philosophy. And it wasn't really until I saw space to respond to some of the work that was coming out from feminist philosophers criticizing a philosophical tradition that I felt very at home in. And so my first essay, Quine is philosopher, or Quine is feminist, the radical import of naturalistic epistemology, was my initially just my attempt to, I thought, correct some misunderstandings about the analytic tradition in epistemology, but also to work in another interest I had, which is an interest in human nature. I had worked for a very short time with an organization called Science for the People in the sociobiology study group, and had gotten very interested in countering the biological determinist theories that were floating around. We're talking about the late 70s, early 80s. Herrnstein and Murray had published the bell curve, reviving the idea that intelligence was genetically determined, and sociobiology, which has sort of morphed into a much more general project called evolutionary psychology, was arguing that rape was natural, it was built into the DNA of men, and that women were destined to be mothers, and this sort of thing. So this paper, which maybe with a little more work should have been a book. It's a very long paper. Really picked up on gender, the nature of knowledge, and the nature of, I wanted to say human nature, but I'd use nature in the title, so this was this was just a rhetorical choice. But so that essay, I think, sort of set the stage for this entire book. And then I started writing more and started engaging more with feminist philosophers, other feminist philosophers. I've kind of argued all the way through that there's no such thing as a feminist approach to philosophy, that feminist philosophy is what philosophers who are feminists do when they apply philosophical techniques and views to the pressing issues of gender justice that we confront.
Great. Yes, I mean, like on the topic of the book, or the name is Only Natural, I have to say I decided to go into nature to read this a couple of times. It was not the best move because so many people stopped me to comment on the cover. Like literally, I was having a meeting in my office a few weeks ago, and someone stopped what they were saying to pick up your book. So yeah, tell us about the cover. I know that's not like substantive philosophical content, but it's just
Well,
it's kind of
enormous, enormous kudos and thanks to Mariana Ortega, who is a brilliant philosopher and a brilliant artist. She was recommended to me by my friend Anne Eden, a philosopher who works in aesthetics and feminist theory. And she recommended that I check out Mariana's work, which I did, and I just thought it was fantastic. And several of the paintings, including the one that the cover came from, seemed to me to be just would be just fabulous for covers. So I got in touch with Mariana and worked with her and told Oxford that they had to do this. And I was prepared to really fight about it, but they just said, "Of course." So the OUP did the design. There's a it's a crop portion of the painting, but I would encourage everybody to go to Mariana Ortega's website and look at all of her amazing work.
Yeah, I really love too that you used a woman philosopher's artistic work on your cover. I think that's a great way to support the community. But all right, now, Louise, I have real hard-hitting questions.
All right, I'm ready.
Because, okay, so the thing that also really surprised me about this book is, and this shouldn't have been a surprise because you were one of my dissertation advisors. So
yes,
I know
I was
eye to eye. But
I
I was reading through this stuff and I was like, wow, Louise and I really don't agree about a lot of stuff. Which probably will make for a better conversation. But why don't we start with the stuff we probably do agree on? When I teach intro to epistemology, one of my favorite essays to assign is your socialization of epistemology, which is in this volume as well. But here and in a couple of essays, you mentioned this concept that you call Dragnet objectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could maybe start by telling us a little bit about what is Dragnet objectivity? Why is it something that looks really attractive to us? And why are you sort of resistant to that particular conception of objectivity?
Okay, let me back up a little bit and say that the two basic philosophical frameworks for thinking about human knowledge current today in analytic philosophy are empiricism and rationalism. And empiricism, if you look it up in the dictionary, Wikipedia, they'll say it's the view that all knowledge comes from experience, and rationalism is the view that all knowledge comes from reason. But that's misleading. Really, there's a disagreement about the nature of the mind. Empiricists think that the mind is completely empty of substantive information when we come into the world. Most of you will have heard the expression tabula rasa, or blank slate. So experience is what adds content to the mind. The rationalists said, no, the mind has structure. They called it innate ideas. The mind has structure, and the structure is substantive, and it puts real constraints on the kinds of things we can come to know, but it also gives us advantages in knowing stuff that we'd never be able to figure out from experience because we're finite beings with a very, 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 very small finite beings with a very limited time on the planet and not a lot of mobility to be able to travel throughout the universe and find out everything that's going on. So this problem of there being very, very little data given our finite existence and lots of stuff to know, that's called the problem of underdetermination. And empiricists really cannot solve it. Rationalists can. That's one of the themes in the book. Now, about the empiricists and Dragnet epistemology. For an empiricist, since all knowledge has to come from experience, anything that interferes, anything that puts stuff into the mind that's not sensory experience, any intrusion of our desires or our values in shaping what we believe, that's all epistemically bad. That's all corrupting. Really, the only good stuff is just the stuff that comes in from the senses. Now, the reference to Dragnet, I don't know how many people are as old as I am and remember this TV show. It was a 50s cop show. There were two cops. One of them was Sergeant Bill Friday, and he was very taciturn, and he could not tolerate witnesses giving their own speculations about who did it or offering observations he didn't ask for, and so he would cut them off and say, "Just the facts, ma'am." And I think that the conception of objectivity, I think the empiricist picture is very attractive. I wish it were true because it would be so much easier to do philosophy of mind if it were. But uh, I think the picture of there being a possibility of our beliefs being based just on the facts and nothing else is very attractive to people. But it's an impossible view about how not human knowledge, or really knowledge of any organism that we know um, of how it works. So it's something that we have to get rid of. Does that?
It does, and I want to. So, initially, I had this question about, what can a feminist philosophy of language tell us about so and so. But as you point out, you don't really think there is such a thing. But I guess I do wonder when if we take on board the rationalist conception of the mind, and we think we have to accept that there are some innate ideas, otherwise we can't explain how we sort of accurately postulate the theories that we do. How does that give us a response to people like Ben Shapiro, who also have this sort of Dragnet line, but it's, facts, not feelings, numbers don't lie, things like that? How can we marshal your work in response to claims like that?
Uh, give me a little more content to work with. What's the sort of line that
Yes, I
you're?
mean, if this comes up with my students a lot, and that's why I'm asking you. So I'm like, maybe you'll have a better answer for me than I have for them. But I'm arguing with someone who says something to me like, "Well, the facts don't lie."
Right. They
Or,
don't. They're facts, right?
or
Yes,
just
indeed.
the facts,
Yes,
or
yes.
facts, not your feelings. How do I explain all of the complicated stuff
Um,
that you just said in a way that's going to grasp them?
um, so I have to think about the pedagogy.
Mhm.
Uh, there are kind of two ways to do it. The really long way is to talk about how perception works.
Mhm.
Perception involves information that comes from the environment. That's the first stage. It's literally inscribed on our sense organs. But then there are a lot of endogenous. There's information that we add. So the visual system, for example, adds the assumption that illumination comes from above. It
Mhm.
adds the assumption that things that are farther away and the same size as things that are close up are going to look smaller. Now, how exactly that information is encoded in the visual system, that's for the vision scientists to figure out. But without those simplifying assumptions, we would not even be able to figure out how things were arranged in space in front of us. So
Mhm.
I guess a first step might be to say, look, there's no such thing as belief based on just the facts. There's all sorts of information that we have to add. Now, when you're talking about more higher level information, like whether the election was stolen or something, there I think you have to dig into the details and say, well, what do you take the facts to be?
Mhm.
And what people are going to take the facts to be are going to be fact. They're going to regard them as facts because they come from a reliable source. So now we have to talk about what a reliable source is. And I think that if you're discussing this with someone of goodwill, they'll
Mhm.
see pretty quickly that at the higher cognitive level, there are all sorts of things that go into our calculation about what to believe.
Yeah.
Who a reliable source is, whether we're in normal conditions, if we've got a fair sampling, if the information source we rely on has been accurate in the past, and so forth. So just, I mean, maybe the challenge would be to get this person to identify what the raw facts were. Um,
Yeah. I
but
love that as a strategy. Um, just out of curiosity, I'm sorry because I know some of these questions are not
yeah.
ones that I see you in advance, but do you have like a favorite example that you go to when you're either teaching this material to your own students, or like thinking about how to prep it in talks to other folks?
Well, when I teach my undergraduate introduction to feminism class, we spend a lot of time on nature nurture issues. And in particular, we look at the claim that testosterone causes aggression.
Mm.
And I rely on work by Anne Fausto Sterling and Cordelia Fine and show them that things that get repeated as facts, like testosterone causes aggression, if you follow the footnotes, if there are footnotes, and if there aren't footnotes, that's a warning sign. You follow the footnotes, and it turns out, Anne Foster Sterling documents this in her book Ms. of Gender, which is very old at this point. But her point was that at the time she was writing, these claims were being made about testosterone causing aggression. And she just documented all, she just listed for us all the studies that there were that even purported to measure circulating serum testosterone and aggression. And as soon as you dig into it, the methodological problems are just immense. So I like this example because it's something that everybody knows, right? And I, even when I'm, being bad, will say stuff like, there's testosterone poisoning here. That is very bad. I think that, maybe a case study, if you have some time, and again, goodwill is absolutely essential. There are some people that don't want to really discuss this rationally, but a case study about a popular belief might move some people.
Okay, yeah. What do you think? In the piece that I wrote that I rely on your piece a lot for. I actually give the marshmallow test as an example, because I think that's a good, for anyone who's not familiar, the marshmallow test was initially devised to determine success later in life based on the ability to complete a task in childhood. And that task was, can you defer a marshmallow now for the promise of 2 marshmallows later? And the idea was people who couldn't defer would be less successful later in life. And in the initial studies, the Black participants did really poorly. And so allegedly that explained the lack of success for Black folks later in life. But in later studies, it turns out that once you control for socioeconomic status, that doesn't replicate. And so I think it's a nice example for thinking about how context shapes how we structure our research questions and attend to the data that we gather.
Yeah, not only does it not replicate, but in the initial case, in the initial study, there was no effort to control for the kid's experience. If your experience is, boy, if there's a marshmallow there, grab it, because who knows?
When are you going to eat again?
Arbitrary, weird grown-up who's putting marshmallows in front of me is going to do what they said. If you're a nice little middle-class white kid like I was, you'd believe them. Now, I wouldn't have eaten it because I don't like marshmallows. So
well, this interview's over. Forget it. Right. I can't talk to someone who doesn't like marshmallows.
I'm actually pretty bad at delaying gratification. Seize the day. I was thinking another example. I was thinking there's another good example. Maybe it'll pop back into my head at a later point, but let's not hold things up.
If it does, please let me know, because I feel like compiling examples.
I got it.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So a related point to this business of underdetermination and how we have to add information when we decide what to believe. One thing about moral evaluation in particular, though this is true throughout any kind of conclusion that we come to on the basis of considering evidence. Reasoning, if it's not reasoning in logic or mathematics, is what's called non-monotonic, which means that you can have a whole body of information. It can really justify a certain conclusion. You can be very well justified in concluding something on the basis of this evidence. But then one new piece of information can just flip things entirely. And my example comes from the TV show MASH. I watch a lot of TV. Comes from the TV show MASH, where Radar, the radar operator, has had to go out into the field to rescue a wounded soldier and bring him to the surgical camp, but the soldier starts choking on his own blood in the car. So Radar gets in touch with the surgeon, Hawkeye, and Hawkeye talks him through an emergency tracheotomy. So the first step is you have to take a knife and plunge it into this little point in the neck. Now, suppose that you come into the television show at that point where Radar is plunging the knife. Boy, that's really good evidence that this guy is a killer and is trying to murder this person. One piece of information, No, he's performing an emergency tracheotomy. Totally flips the
Yeah.
valence. So that's something to keep in mind is that, and it makes finding out what's true really, really hard.
Right. It's not a snapshot. It's
No,
something stretched out over time.
right.
Yeah, I love that. I do actually want to ask you a few more questions if you're up for it on your Quine as a feminist piece.
Sure.
First of all, explain that title to us.
Okay, so Willard Van Orman Quine, a very eminent philosopher in the 20th century in the United States, was very, very conservative politically. I have to say, at a personal level, he was scrupulously fair, but politically, he was awful. I think he had once remarked that what we needed to do in Vietnam was bomb them back to the Stone Age. So he was not, signing up for feminism. But what I was thinking was that the program he made a lot of really important contributions to analytic philosophy. His main contribution to epistemology, in my view, was to advocate a naturalized approach to epistemology. So the traditional approach would be to say, well, let's think about what knowledge is. Let's try to formulate a definition of knowledge, and we'll test it by coming up with cases and seeing if the definition gives us the right results. Well, he said, let's forget about defining knowledge. Let's assume that knowledge exists, that knowledge is a natural phenomenon. It's a fact that we know stuff about the world. And now ask, how do we do it? Now, this was against the background. Sorry, I should have added one more piece to the traditional picture. The traditional picture said, well, let's see if we can rationally reconstruct knowledge. Let's see if we can take the sensory data that a scientific theory is based on and in a stepwise fashion derive the theory. Now, this is not the way scientists proceed. They don't go from the bottom up. They go all over the place in all different directions. They build on what people have done before. If an experiment doesn't work out, they try to see what they did wrong rather than give up their theory. All this stuff that doesn't look like science is supposed to look if you read the logical positivist, for example. So what Quine said was, well, how do they do it? How do they do it? And he was the person that really made me aware of the underdetermination problem.
Okay.
And although he was himself a staunch empiricist in many ways, he came to the realization that there had to be a lot of native help in our figuring out what to think altogether on the basis of the evidence that we have. And so what he said was we should look to natural science to find out how we come to know the things we come to know. And I thought that's a very, very good plan for feminists or activists to look to the empirical sciences and see what we're really like and figure out how, in various ways, creatures like us confront the world and try to find things out. And we might find some surprising things, like that we can't get rid of biases. We depend on biases. That means that when the biases are pernicious, when they're racist or sexist, we've got to think about, we have to think differently about what makes them bad. So Quine identified what he called, well, the first thing was he said we have to have an innate similarity space. Everything resembles everything else in some respect and is different from everything in some respect. So what are the parameters of similarity? What are the properties that we use to group things that have enabled us to say identify members of different species of animals, learn about plants, learn about the physical world. Now, what was going on at the same time was Chomsky was initiating the cognitive revolution. And so people were saying, oh, we can talk about the mind. We don't have to be behaviorists anymore. We can posit innate structures. We can investigate them experimentally. That was all going on just down the road from Harvard, where Quine was. And I was very confused about why Quine wasn't like, rah, rah, that's just what I was talking about. But he wasn't.
Right.
So it was meant to be a joke, that the idea that Willard Van Orman Quine was a feminist. But I thought, interestingly, he has proposed this radical change in the way we do epistemology that I think is A, sound, and B, apt to be very useful in our political lives as well as our everyday lives.
And I mean, I think hugely influential. personally, I learned the two dogmas of empiricism in grad school and didn't think I was going to be an epistemologist, so didn't pay much attention to it, and only really came back to Quine because of you, actually. And so it's like you're keeping Quine alive, and I'm thankful for that, because there is something of value in a lot of the work that he does. But in your answer, you mentioned something about, like, native structures of the mind, figuring out biases, and so that leads me to this piece that comes up in the third section of your book, Natures and Norms. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is because I got this question this summer, actually, when I was at St. Andrews. Why are we so committed to thinking that nature is a normative guide to how we ought to live? And when is it useful and when is it to be abandoned?
The why we're so interested, I think that's a question for an intellectual historian. Uh, I, I don't know that I've ever been terribly taken with it. Maybe that's why I had the sort of, I don't know, emotional space to say that it doesn't have any normative significance at all. But well, I mean, I don't know what to say, Brianna, really. There is I think, maybe there's certainly some role that religion plays for at least some people, that nature is God's handiwork, and so it must be good. At the same time, it's also part of many religious traditions. The one that I was brought up in, Catholicism and Judaism and many strains of Protestantism as well, that human nature either is or involves this very, very bad thing, and that the bad part of our nature is attached to our materiality. So, nature is good unless it's our human nature, which is bad. I mean, I don't know how clearly people think about these things. I never, I graduated from high school in '71, so I kind of missed the hippies, but I never was taken with this idea that that we should all be natural, because first of all, I like my creature comforts too much, but also I thought,
uh,
death's head mushrooms are natural. I mean, there's so much in the natural world. It's dangerous and unpleasant,
yes.
and so forth. But yeah, so I would only speculate, and on the basis of not very much evidence.
Right.
Why
So
people have
then,
that.
so I guess one of the things I want to know then is because you brought up this term in the very first answer to the first question I gave, biological essentialism.
Mm-hmm.
Because that definitely seems to be a view that appeals pretty rigidly to our nature. So can you say a little bit about what that view is?
Yeah. So uh, okay. I should say, from a philosophical point of view,
Mhm.
um, since the Greeks and maybe before, there's been an association between, there's the idea of our nature as what makes us human. And that seems to be connected in the minds of the ancients with what is good for us. And again, the first time I heard that which was really in graduate school, I thought, I don't see that that's the case. But anyway, I'm certainly not a scholar of ancient philosophy. But uh, sorry, circle back to the thing that you just asked me.
Biological essentialism.
Biological
Yeah.
essentialism. Okay, so if you do have this idea that, there are a couple of ideas involved in biological essentialism. One is the idea that, in some sense, our essence, what makes us human, or what makes us the individual human that we are, is something to do with our biology. I actually believe that. I think that if you look at the notion of essence as it functions in science, or as it's sort of presumed in science, I think that our genotype is a good candidate for being what makes us what we are. But the mistake is to think that our genotype or some other biological factor dictates the way we appear, dictates our phenotype. It does not. It dictates a complicated, really complicated function from genotype and environment to phenotype.
Mhm.
So it does determine what kind of being we're going to look like, feel like, act like, um, given an environment. But given how many different environments there are, and given how complex the genotype is, I mean, it's not just a simple. There are a couple of traits that are predictable on the basis of one or two genes, but for the
Mhm.
most part, the genome is just incredibly complicated. There are different parts of it that are regulatory. There are different parts of it that build proteins. It's just really, really complicated. So the idea that you could actually calculate what somebody's phenotype would be in a given environment where you don't even know all the environmental factors that are
Yeah.
important is just ridiculous. Now, what you can do is you can find correlations at the phenotypic level between certain kinds of gross genetic differences, like whether you have whether you have XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes, and whether you are likely to commit, or whether you are statistically likely to commit a violent crime. You can do that, but that doesn't give you the etiology of the behavior.
Mhm.
And the idea that your biology fixes what you want or what you're going to be like as a character or what your abilities are is just, it's biologically really stupid. Um,
Mhm.
Now, the use that's, I mean, I think maybe one of the best takedowns of biological determinism is in John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women. Because he points out that there's this weird pattern of argument that says, look, it's in women's nature to want to be domestic and not to engage in public life. That's what they really want. That's what will make them happy. Um, uh, and anyway, they can't do it. They can't engage in public life. They don't have the capability. You say, well, what if somebody tries? And then the answer is, well, if she tries and succeeds, she's going to be very, very unhappy. And then Mill says, okay, but if she's going to be so unhappy, why do we have to work so hard to prevent her from trying to enter public life?
Yeah.
And then the answer can only be, well, she doesn't know what's good for her. So this pattern that you can't do something because of your nature, but then there are these people that do. Oh, but they're very, very unhappy. Well, isn't it their choice to be unhappy? Well, no, they don't know what they want. So you
Mhm.
go from determinism to an argument from well-being to a paternalistic argument that, sweetheart, just sit quietly and, well, don't sit quietly, take care of the house and raise the kids, but after that, sit quietly and don't aspire to do anything in public.
That makes it really helpful to, I think, to see the connection between those sorts of views and religiosity, though, because you do get this sense of like, you were made to play this role.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
then
I religious traditions are very varied, and even within the religious traditions I'm familiar with, there's a lot of variation. So I don't want to pin this
yeah.
all on religion. And religion comes from somewhere, so probably there's something deeper. Um, yeah, I could give an example of a genetically controlled trait where there was a novel environmental change that nobody anticipated,
Yeah.
that changed the picture. So probably a lot of people watching are familiar with this. There's a condition called phenylketonuria, which is an inability to metabolize a certain amino acid. And what happens with individuals who have this is that fluid builds up in their brain, and there's usually almost always very severe mental retardation, if not death. And it starts happening as soon as the child is born and has to ingest their own food. Um, and it was pretty inexorable. I think there was a genetic test for, actually, I'm not sure about this. I think it was known that there was a genetic factor that predicted this before it was really understood how that gene functioned in producing the effect. Well, once the biochemical mechanism became known, they realized that what was going on was that there was a failure, that this genetic alteration deprive the individual of the mechanism to build the proteins that need, or sorry, to metabolize these proteins. Once they understood that, they said, "Oh, we just have to get phenylalanine out of the kids' diets." Now I say just, it's a very difficult diet. Parents struggle with it. The kids don't like it. But the point was that, you can't from the genetic difference. I mean, you can explain the variance, who gets phenylketonuria, who doesn't. Well, it's the presence or absence of this gene, but that doesn't tell you if there's something that you can do about it. So the fact that there is some determinism, the genes do determine this function, since we since the function is so complicated and we don't know all the environmental factors that are mutable that we can change, we don't know whether the condition, whether the phenotypic condition can be prevented given the genotype. Um, and there are lots of things like that. There are lots of, there's great progress now in treating sickle cell anemia because of things we found out about ways we can alter the environment that weren't foreseen originally.
So I have several questions to ask you still, but we have a lot from the audience. And so I'm going to relinquish my control. I'm going to give up my power to questions from the audience. And then at the end, I might ask you just a few wrap up questions. All right. Okay. So we have one from Natalie Russell. She asked, they ask, you have followed feminism for a few decades now. Where do you think it has got to, and how can it be doing better? Also, how, if at all, could some of your ideas be useful in helping feminism to move past some of its current impasses? And I bring up this question first because I'm also wondering if you can talk about it in relation to your androgyny piece and sort of how that debate has changed between 1998 when you first wrote it and today.
Yeah. Okay. My view of gender is that it's a system of social roles, and that it exists because of the robust difference between men and women with respect to reproductive capacities. That's not to say that all females are women, all and only females are women, and it's not to say that to be a woman is to be a female. The existence of the social system allows for some fluidity about that. But I do think that we need the concept of woman to identify the members of the social class. And the class is going to look different in different times in history in different parts of the world. But it is just a robust historical constant that women are dominated by men socially, that they're disadvantaged in virtue of being women. And I think there's an ideology that I don't have any special knowledge about where the system came from. Was it, de Beauvoir, Marxists think that it had to do with property, that gender arose when people began to hold property and men wanted to be secure in their paternity. I don't know. But we have gender, and the consequences of it have been, without exception, there are some writers, Zike Ndegwu argues that Igbo society doesn't have gender in the sense that I'm talking about. But it's a pretty robust regularity in human history that women are disadvantaged materially and socially for being women. The ideology that goes with it is misogyny, and I think unfortunately today we have just tons of evidence of the intensity of misogyny. Why is Nancy Pelosi so hated? That there have been attacks on her, and of course the most recent attack on her husband. Yeah. She's the Speaker of the House in the United States government. Why is she particularly bad? It's got to do with her being a woman. It's got to do with her being a woman. The hatred of Hillary Clinton, when she was the first lady, there was vicious sexist stuff directed at her because she's a woman. Amya Srinivasan's excellent book, The Right to Sex, has a chapter documenting the mindset and actions of so-called incels, involuntary celibates. So it's out there, and it's woman hatred, and I don't think I think this is hatred of anyone in that class.
Mhm.
So I think that unfortunately, I think that in the United States, there's been backsliding. I mean, obviously, on reproductive rights, women's ability to control their fertility is in grave danger across the country. And the dismantling of affirmative action, of course, this is going to have terrible consequences for members of racial minorities who have been discriminated against in the past. And currently still are. It'll be harder to address those factors. So the agenda, I'm sorry to say, I think looks very, very similar to what it looked like in the so-called second wave in the mid-century, mid-20th century. I think that gender activism, action from people who had gay and lesbians who were claiming their right to sexual orientation, and now individuals who are trans or non-binary or queer, who are claiming their right to be the gender they want or to be no gender at all. I think that has changed things. I think it's created a lot of interesting issues in philosophy. Politically, it's a no-brainer. Everyone has to be supported to be the person that they want to be, and that's just a bottom line. My position on gender is so I said gender is a social role. I think what the social role does is bring into concordance, bring together sets of properties that have no particular reason to be together at all.
Yeah.
And there's no reason to have such a force. So I am a normative gender eliminativist, which means that I think gender ought not to exist. That may put me into conflict with some trans activists who want there to be gender because they claim being a member of a certain gender is part of their identity. But overall, I think the harms of having gender far outweigh the benefits. That's a glib and overly simplistic response to a very difficult and complicated question. But I'm also a gender realist. I think that here and now, gender is real. We have to acknowledge that, and we have to deal with it, and we have to keep tracking how women are doing. Have they lost their jobs more during the pandemic? Are girls still not getting the educations that they deserve, and so forth? I was going to say one other thing. I think there's a parallel here with the position that some theorists take on the subject of race. Ron Mallon and Michael Hardiman. I think I got the distinction between normative eliminativism and descriptive realism from Ron Mallon, actually, that race is here, we've got it, we can't ignore it, we can't not see race. We have to have racial categories so that we understand what's going on in social reality. But I would be in favor of eliminating race if we could do it.
Oh yeah. I like that. Yeah, let's get rid of it all. I just think like if my dad were at this talk, he'd just be absolutely bamboozled. Get rid of gender, get rid of race. Like that's chaos. Chaos.
Now, I say this as a pretty white, pretty femme presenting person, so it's not like, it's not like I practice what I preach. God forbid, that would be so hard. But yeah, so that's where I think we ought to be headed. And well, you asked how is it different? I mean, I think we were making some progress for a while, and things have gotten very, very bad. And I have to say, I think they've gotten bad because of the Republicans who serve extremely wealthy people who see using racial animosity and gender hatred as tools that they can get to distract people from what is really the problem in this country, which is severe inequality and lack of opportunity.
We could have a whole other conversation that's an hour long about that, but I want to try and get to one more question from the audience. This one comes from Naomi Sheeman. What would naturalized epistemology look like if we started from the fact of ineliminable epistemic dependency? So that is that the vast majority of what we know or believe comes from other people. Just as you argue that we need to posit innate structures pre-existing experiential evidence, it's more obviously true that our entanglement with and dependency on other people pre-exist our use of experiential evidence. So why not start there?
Yeah, I don't agree with Naomi's an old friend. Naomi, I don't agree with Naomi about our radical dependence. I think there's a lot. I think kids are born knowing a lot of stuff, including a lot of social stuff. In fact, if they didn't know the social stuff when they got here, they wouldn't be able to acquire it from the environment. But I'm not sure what it means to start to make epistemic dependency a starting point. I mean, I've certainly written about how dependent we all are on testimony. And I've argued that, I believe in what's called situated knowledge, which means that I think our knowledge practices are not necessarily universally good, that they work in the environments that we've sort of developed in, and they might not work in other environments. I think it's really remarkable, for example, that we can still see things when we are traveling at 70 miles an hour down the highway, because in the ancestral environment, nobody went that fast, nothing moved that fast, and yet our vision system seems to be able to do it. That's an interesting fact. As far as epistemic dependency, I think testimony is an important area of epistemology, but it's not all there is.
So when are we going to get your new book with all of the interesting stuff that came up today?
I don't know.
So like this is
all
all
right to Oxford and demand it.
So I'm like, yeah, we need to talk about why our country's moving backwards. We need to talk about like the distinction between nature and nurture, and justification. Like there's a lot of new ground to cover still.
Can I just say about the political stuff? I'm not the person to talk to. Really, they're just terrifically well-informed, lucid, clear people out there. There's some great podcasts. There are great publications. The Nation in these times. I won't list all my favorite podcasts and so forth, but there are people that know tons about this and have insofar as I know anything, it's because I listen to these people. I will put in a plug for one of my currently favorite books by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us, and she's the one that gave me the idea that it's the bad Republicans who are deliberately using racial animus and gender hatred to convince white people who are harmed by racism that they ought to be racist. I just think it's this totally wonderful book, and she's amazing. So read that book.
Well, to contradict everything you just said, that minus the book recommendation, what really impresses me / intimidates me reading this book is I was just like, God, Louise knows so much about politics and science, which I find really intimidating as a subject, and the history of philosophy. And so one of the things you mentioned in the intro is you're telling the story about how you came to this collection of essays into your research area, even as you mentioned that you went to the Boston Socialist Feminist Union, that you were in Science for the People. Give us your pro tips. What are they? Like, how can those of us who want to be more involved, more engaged philosophers, what are some steps that we might take to go about deepening our philosophical practice so that it engages more with the world?
So one time I went to a talk by Noam Chomsky. I went to every talk by Noam Chomsky that I could get to. And somebody said, how do you put together your politics and what's the connection you see between your politics and your linguistics? Mm-hmm. And Chomsky said, as he often said in response to questions, I don't understand the question. You seem to be presupposing that a person can't be interested in more than one thing. So the only advice I have is get engaged in the world. do the philosophy that moves you, that interests you, that fascinates you, that you can spend hours reading articles in and stuff. And if the connections are there, they'll come to you. So
Mhm.
that's one thing. The other thing I think is that my experience has been that people like an argument. They like reasons set out clearly in ways they can understand, and and that's something that we are trained to do, that we're sort of good at doing. And I'm really happy about the extent to which people like you and uh, many other philosophers now are just engaging with the public on issues where they have, some, if not something new to say, at least a way of framing an issue, making distinctions, calling attention to the sort of logic of the situation. I think that's a contribution philosophers can make. And there are lots of good venues, including the Philosopher magazine, that we can publish in. But also letters to the editor, get on the speakers bureau of the local reproductive rights action group in your area.
Oh my God, Louise, when I was visiting you, I remember you telling me that you actually go to your town hall meetings.
Of course. Well, we have town, we don't, we have town meeting. This is a New
Tell me.
England institution. We govern by direct democracy once a year in town meeting. And I don't always go, but I go when I can. And
But I
it's
remember thinking like,
pretty
wow,
amazing.
that's so impressive. Like, and like
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
a lot of us get disconnected from our local politics, and it was so
yeah,
nice to see that you
that's
weren't.
yeah, thank you for bringing it up because that is really important. I mean, if you look at what's happened to state legislatures around the country, it's because people didn't pay attention to local elections. And, first Koch and now many villains have swooped in with a lot of money and gotten people. I mean, I don't have the statistics handy, but uh, quite a few quite a few large states with many electoral votes have legislatures that are terribly unrepresentative of the opinion. I mean, Ohio is like this, and we notice in Ohio it's really a purple state. There's a lot of it's not a red state. There's a lot of Democratic sympathy, but the legislature is almost entirely Republican, and it's because of the sort of getting in and getting into these local elections, and until you've got a majority in the state legislature, and then they can just do what they want. So, yeah, think local. I mean, think global. What is it? Think global, act locally.
At local.
Yeah, but keep track of what's going on locally. It's hard.
Yeah, I think that's why I found the intro so like compelling, because it was nice to see that this is what the journey to this looks like. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of engagement, it's a lot of activism. And we're actually at 4, so I suppose I should start wrapping up. But I do want to say before we close, as like a young woman of color working in philosophy, I am endlessly grateful to people like you, Sally Haslanger, Christy Dotson, Charles Mills, because y'all just make it 3,000 times easier to be here in these spaces, first of all, but then to be able to like justify the stuff I work on by saying, but look, Louise Antony does it, and it's so impressive. So I just want to say thank you. I can't make everyone unmute and clap, but if I could, I would. So yeah,
Well,
thank you for this body of work.
I appreciate the thanks, but thank you for being in the new generation who's so committed and um, devoting your considerable intelligence to important issues in philosophy and trying to make the world a better place.